motor control of movements, or we can name it as the production of voluntary movement. In this lecture, we are going to understand how our nervous system regulates the skeletal muscle for the production of voluntary movement and the production of reflexes. We saw this slide previously and we discussed the different areas of the brain and how they work to produce either the production of voluntary movement, as we discussed the role of the basal ganglia cerebellum with the motor area, and the role of the hypothalamus in the regulation of the homeostasis, the role of the thalamus as a relay station, and the brainstem and its role in the regulation of the arterial blood pressure, respiration, salivation, and the reflexes produced by the eye muscles. Also, this slide, we saw it previously, and we discussed the mapping of the cerebral cortex into motor areas and sensory areas. Going to the primary motor area or area 4, the primary motor area or the area 4. But to understand the production of voluntary movement, to produce any voluntary movement, you need the interaction of two neurons. You need the interaction of two neurons, upper motor neuron, and lower motor neuron. So any voluntary movement is produced in response to the interaction or the stimulation of the upper motor neuron and the lower motor neuron. So what is the lower motor neuron? The lower motor neuron is the motor unit you studied before. It is consisted of the motor neuron and the skeletal muscle fiber supplied by it. You remember the motor unit? The motor unit is the motor neuron coming from the spinal cord or from the brainstem and the muscle fiber supplying by it. This is known as the motor unit. But what is the meaning of the lower motor neuron? The lower motor neuron is the alpha motor neurons that innervate the skeletal muscles. So it consists of the alpha motor neurons located in the spinal cord and the motor efferent supplying the skeletal muscle. That is the lower motor neuron. Interruption of the lower motor neuron produce muscle paralysis. If you cut this motor neuron supplying the muscle, there is muscle paralysis. But what is the upper motor neuron? The upper motor neuron is consisting of the motor areas present in the higher centers as those present in the brain. For example, the primary motor area, the premotor areas, the basal ganglia, the cerebellum, different nuclei located in the brainstem. All these areas are known as the higher centers for the production of voluntary movement. So we have the motor area, like the primary motor area 4, the premotor area 6, we have nuclei of the basal ganglia, we have the cerebellum and some nuclei in the brainstem, and these areas have something which is called descending tracts, and these descending tracts are usually terminates on the alpha anterior horn cells of the spinal cord, on the alpha and gamma anterior horn cells of the spinal cord that supply or innervate the skeletal muscle. So the upper motor neuron consists of the motor areas distributed in the cerebral cortex, the basal ganglia, the cerebellum, the motor nuclei in the brainstem and their descending tracts, and these descending tracts are going to produce what? Controlling the activity of the motor neurons located in the spinal cord or in the brainstem. So they are innervating the muscles indirectly. So the upper motor neuron is essential for the production of voluntary movement. For example, if you would like now to move your pencil or to move your hand or start writing something, what's happened? You have impulses generated from the higher centers, and these impulses descend to the spinal cord or descend through the spinal cord through the descending tracts to reach to the motor neurons present in the spinal cord that's connected to the muscles of your hand to control them. The motor neurons, the lower motor neuron rising from the spinal cord and reaching to the muscles of your hand, that is the lower motor neuron. The upper motor neuron is the impulses or the part which innervates the motor neurons of the spinal cord, bringing the impulses from the higher centers. So motor activity begins in the primary motor areas. Any voluntary movement should start in the primary motor areas, because this area, which is a primary motor area or area 4, which is located in the precentral gyrus of the spinal cord, has the presentation of all the muscles of the body. All the muscles of the side of one side of the body or the half of the body is presented here. And as we remember, or if you remember, we have here the area of representation is dependent on the complexity of the voluntary movement produced by the muscles. For example, we have here the muscles of production of speech. We have here the muscles controlling the face, the muscles controlling the eye. Here the muscles controlling the hand. The part of the body that produces skilled movement, the area of representation is extensive or is greater in the brain or in the primary motor areas, or they have greater representation in the cerebral cortex than the areas that produce non-skilled movement. The motor cortex also has a homunculus map with more cortical areas devoted to the muscles involved in skilled, complex, or delicate movement. Any motor neuron that's not directly responsible for stimulating the target muscle is called the upper motor neuron. Upper motor neuron start in the motor cortex of the brain and terminates within the medulla oblongata or within the spinal cord. Terminates on what? Terminates on the motor neurons located in the medulla or located in the spinal cord to stimulate the lower motor neuron that supplies the skeletal muscle. If you cut the upper motor neuron, if we have a lesion or damage in the upper motor neuron, this leads to loss of the voluntary movement, and we have a paralysis. And this type of paralysis is usually known as spastic paralysis. While if we interrupt the lower motor neuron, we have also paralysis, and the paralysis in this situation is known as flaccid paralysis. So the upper motor neuron and the lower motor neuron are essential for the production of voluntary movement. Somatic motor pathways. For the production of voluntary movement, we have a group of circuits that is connecting the sensory, motor, and association areas of the cerebral cortex with the basal ganglia neurons and the cerebellar neurons with what? With the local circuit of neurons in the brainstem and spinal cord. And at the end, these areas, when they are stimulated, they discharge impulses through the descending tracts by a specific pathway or by the pyramidal tract and the extrapyramidal tract to control the activity of the lower motor neurons that innervate the skeletal muscle directly. So the interaction between the local circuits of brain and the local circuit of neurons in the brainstem and spinal cord and the motor areas with the sensory and association areas with the role of the basal ganglia and the cerebellar neurons are going to control and discharge impulses by a specific manner through the descending tracts to control the activity of the skeletal muscles through controlling the activity of the lower motor neuron. If we would like to summarize this, for example, if you would like to cross the road, if you would like to do a voluntary movement by crossing the road, how can you take the decision of crossing the road through the connection or the interconnection of these neurons? We have firstly to receive sensory information about the position of the body and the visual information about the position of the body in relation to the surrounding objects, and even the auditory information about the moving objects that's present in the road. All these information are gathered together, and we are going to give this information to what? To the motor areas. And also we have to send some of this information to the basal ganglia. What is the role of the basal ganglia? The basal ganglia is going to produce something which is called the cognitive function. Which is what? Which is the transformation of the thought into motor act. The transformation of the motor thought into a motor act by detecting which muscles are going to be contracting and the sequence of the contracting muscles, the onset and offset of the contracting muscle. This is occurring at the level of the basal ganglia. Another information should be processed at the level of the cerebellum. The cerebellum is receiving the sensory information about the position of the body from the spinocerebellar pathways, and also receiving the motor information you are going to perform by the motor areas. And the cerebellum is going to judge the amount of impulses discharging from the motor areas. And at the end, the impulses discharged from the motor areas and the motor nuclei present in the brainstem going down to the spinal cord to affect the lower motor neuron, and when they are going to affect the lower motor neuron, they giving the orders for the skeletal muscles, so you produce the voluntary movement. So the production of voluntary movement needs the interaction between multiple circuits, between the sensory areas in the cerebral cortex, the basal ganglion neurons, the cerebellar neurons, and the motor areas, plus the motor nuclei in the brain stem. Lower motor neuron, a nerve cell that goes from the spinal cord to a muscle, is known as alpha motor neuron, or the final common pathway, which provides output from the central nervous system to the skeletal muscle fiber, that is the lower motor neuron. So, as we mentioned previously, the production of the voluntary movement needs the interaction of the upper motor neuron, which consists of these neuronal circuits and their descending tracts in the spinal cord. This is known as the upper motor neuron and the lower motor neuron. Organization of the upper motor neuron. We have direct motor pathways, and we have indirect motor pathways. The direct motor pathway is usually include the axons extend directly from the cerebral cortex, and that is mainly the pyramidal tract or the corticobulbospinal tract. The direct motor pathway include axons extend directly from the cerebral cortex, that is the corticobulbospinal tract. Indirect motor pathway, this includes the extrapyramidal tract. Both of these tracts aim to control nerve impulses to the lower motor neuron, which stimulate the skeletal muscle contraction. For example, if you would like to perform writing movement or typing or a piano playing or any complex movement, we have two categories of muscles are working. We have the distal muscles of limbs, like the muscles in your hands and fingers, and you have the proximal muscles, which is present in the neck, which is present in the trunk, which is present in the shoulder. So the interaction between these two types of muscles and the postural background produced by the proximal muscles of the trunk and the skilled movement produced by the hands needs the interaction of these two pathways. These two pathways are working together to produce the skilled movement. One of them is going to initiate the contraction of the distal muscles of the limbs, and another one is going to control your muscle tone, control your posture, gives something we name it as postural background for the production of voluntary movement. Direct motor pathway, the corticospinal tract or the pyramidal tract. This tract is the major tract controlling the activity of the skeletal muscles. The fibers of this tract originate from the primary motor area. For 30% of the fiber are coming from the primary motor area, 30% of the fiber coming from the premotor area, area 6, and 40% of the fibers are coming from the primary somatic sensory areas of the cerebral cortex. So the origin of this tract is not purely from the motor areas, it's coming from the motor and sensory areas of the cerebral cortex. The axons of this tract pass down through the posterior limb of the internal capsule, then it descends in the midbrain, bones, and the medulla oblongata. It descends in the or through the midbrain, bones, and the medulla oblongata. And when they are going to descend in the brain stem, they are giving innervation to the cranial motor nuclei. They are giving innervation to the cranial motor nuclei. The cranial motor nuclei are what? Are the cranial nerves 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 9, 10, 11, 12. So they are going to innervate most of the cranial nerves on their course in the midbrain, bones, and medulla oblongata. You will find that the cranial nerves 1 to 8 are purely sensory. They are not innervated by this tract. So the motor fibers of the pyramidal tract, when they descend in the brainstem, they are supplying the cranial motor nuclei from 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 9, and 10, 11, and 12. We have 12 pair of cranial nerves. They are supplying all the cranial nerves on both sides. They are supplying the cranial nerves or the cranial motor nuclei on both sides, except the lower part of the facial and the hypoglossal nucleus. The lower part of the facial or the hypoglossal, they are innervated from the opposite side only. And this part is known as the corticobulbar part. Then when they cross from the medulla or pass from the upper part of the medulla, we have 90% of the fiber cross to the opposite side and decussate to the opposite side to form what? To form the lateral corticospinal tract. So 90% of the fiber cross to the opposite side, and when they cross to the opposite side, they descend in a tract called lateral corticospinal tract. And the 10% who didn't descend are going to continue on the same side as the anterior corticospinal tract. So 90% of the fiber are what? Are descending on the opposite side as lateral corticospinal tract. The remaining 10% descend undecussating, uncrossed on the same side to what? To pass as the anterior corticospinal tract. What is the significance or what is the function of both tracts? The lateral corticospinal tract is usually going to supply what? Going to supply the laterally situated anterior horn cells or alpha motor neurons. That is the anterior horn of the spinal cord. We have here two types of nuclei. We have laterally situated nuclei, medially situated nuclei. The laterally situated nuclei are the part or the nuclei that supply the distal muscles of the limbs, like the muscles of the fingers, like muscles of the hand. That's the muscles that produce skilled movement, while the medially situated anterior horn cells, are supplying or controlling the axial muscles, or the proximal muscles of the trunk, like muscles of the back, muscles of the neck, muscles of the shoulders, muscle controlling the hip. So we have lateral corticospinal tract. The lateral corticobulbospinal tract is supplying the laterally situated anterior horn cells that produce control of the distal muscles of the limbs that perform highly skilled movement of hands and feet, while the anterior corticospinal tract is going to supply the axial muscles, control movement of the axial muscle. So for the production of voluntary movement, both are going to work together. The lateral corticospinal tract move your hands, move your fingers, move you to do the skilled movement, while the anterior corticospinal tract is going to produce regulation of the muscles of the trunk to produce something which is called the postural background. We have the part we mentioned it previously, which is a corticobulbar, which consists of the supply of the corticobulbar part which are the supplying the cranial motor nuclei located in the brainstem. Supplying the what? Supplying the cranial motor nuclei in the brainstem that produce voluntary movement of the eyes, movements of the tongue, movement of the neck, chewing, the facial expression and speech are regulated by the corticobulbar tract. The corticobulbar tract. Indirect motor pathways is known as the extrapyramidal pathways, and the extrapyramidal pathways are usually going to produce what? Regulation or control of the axial muscles of the trunk or the proximal muscles of the limbs. And these tracts are usually the rubrospinal tract, or named as the rubrospinal tract, tectospinal tract, vestibulospinal, lateral and medial reticulospinal tract. Usually they are going to control the gamma motor neurons. The gamma motor neurons. What is the gamma motor neurons? If you remember, the gamma motor neurons is the motor neuron that innervate the intrafusal muscle fibers. The intrafusal muscle fiber located in the muscle spindle. So they have a great role in the regulation of the muscle tone. They have a great role in the regulation of the muscle tone. Modulation of movement by the cerebellum, or the role of the cerebellum in production of voluntary movement. Cerebellum has an important role in the production of the skilled movement, or the performance of learned movement in an executive way, or performance of the skilled movements in a rapid way. And also it has a role in regulation of posture and equilibrium. The cerebellum is receiving multiple sensory information. The cerebellum is receiving multiple sensory information from the proprioceptors, from the vestibular receptors, like the macula and the crista, from visual receptors. So what's going? The cerebellum is receiving a lot of information about the position of the body and the position of the head in relation to the gravitational force, the position of the muscles and the joints of the body, and the position of the body in relation to the surroundings. All these sensory information are what? Are perceived at the level of the cerebellum. Also, the cerebral cortex, which is going to produce, or the motor areas that produce the motor activity or production of voluntary movement coming from the motor area, are also sending some of these information, or a copy of the information they charge to the muscles, to the cerebellum. So the cerebellum is receiving what? Is receiving a copy from the motor acts. So the cerebellum receives the position of the body and also receives the motor information, or the copy of the motor commands coming from the motor areas, and the cerebellum is going to compare between the position of the body and the amount of impulses charging from the cerebral cortex. So he is going to judge and decide if this information or this impulses is sufficient or insufficient, and is going to produce controlling of the voluntary activity. He sends corrective feedback in case of any discrepancy or error through the thalamus or the upper motor neuron. So it receives sensory information and receives motor information from the motor area, compare between them, and produce judgment or deciding if this information is suitable or not. How can we know this? We know this from the lesions. The damage to the cerebellum caused ataxia. Ataxia means in coordination of the voluntary movement. The subjects cannot produce the rapid movements, like for example repeated supination and pronation of the hands. And if you ask the subject to do, for example, movement of his finger to the nose, he cannot stop his hand at the intended point. He has something which is called dysmetria. Dysmetria means he cannot stop his hands at the intended point. Why? Damage of the cerebellum. Also, the cerebellum, or the damage of the cerebellum, is associated with something, we name it as intention tremors or kinetic tremors. What is the meaning of intention tremors or kinetic tremors? It is involuntary muscle contraction usually occur during the production of voluntary movement. During the production of voluntary movement, it is known as kinetic tremors. It is known as kinetic tremors. This manifestation or this kinetic tremors was in coordination of the voluntary movement with this dysmetria, and it is also associated with hypotonia. It is also associated with unsteady gait. All these manifestation is caused by the cerebellar lesion. So what is the role of the cerebellum? Cerebellum plays a role in the production of voluntary movement. It has a role in the timing and joining of the voluntary movement. It has a role in the production of the learned or skilled movements, as well as regulation of the muscle tone and regulation of equilibrium. Motor nuclei of the basal ganglia. Motor nuclei of the basal ganglia, or the role of the basal ganglia in the production of voluntary movement. We have two important circuits you will study in detail, and these circuits are present between the sensory areas, basal ganglia and motor areas of the cerebral cortex, between sensory areas and the basal ganglia and the cerebral cortex motor areas. These circuits are essential for the transformation of the thoughts into acts, the transformation of thoughts into acts. And when they studied where is the first place in which we record action potential before the voluntary movement, we found that the action potential firstly is generated in the basal ganglia. So usually the basal ganglia is the first place we record action potential in it before the production of voluntary movement. It has an extensive circuit with the different sensory and motor areas of the cerebral cortex. They have a role in the transformation of the thought into acts. So they participate in initiation and determination. They suppress unwanted movement. They influence the muscle tone. The most common lesion affecting the basal ganglia is the Parkinson's disease. The most common lesion, degenerative disease affecting the basal ganglia, is known as the Parkinson's disease. And Parkinson is caused by degeneration of the dopaminergic neurons, the neurons that release dopamine. The decrease in the level of dopamine produces the Parkinson's disease. And this Parkinson's disease is associated with something which is called the uncontrolled muscle movement, which is known as the static tremors. Tremors appears during rest. Tremors appear during rest. And these tremors are in the form of bell rolling, So they appear in rest in the form of bell rolling, and also Parkinson is associated with rigidity. Rigidity means increase in the muscle tone. We have another disease affecting the basal ganglia, which is Huntington disease, due to damage affecting the GABAergic neurons, and is associated with rapid jerky movement that occur involuntarily and without purpose. Rapid jerky movement, gross movements affecting gross muscles in the body, and usually this appear involuntarily and without purpose. This is known as Huntington disease. Spinal cord reflexes. To understand the reflex, we have to define what is the meaning of a reflex. Reflex is involuntary response to a stimulus. And what is the meaning of a spinal cord reflex? It is reflex, its center is located in the spinal cord. So again, what is the definition of reflex? Involuntary response to a stimulus. Involuntary response to a stimulus. So there is contraction of the skeletal muscle, and this contraction is involuntarily. And the spinal cord reflexes means the center of the reflex is present in the spine. So again, what is the definition of reflex? Reflex is involuntary response to stimulus, and they serve to what? To regulate some of our activities, like if we remember the muscle tone reflex and the Golgi tendon organ reflex. So a reflex is fast, involuntary, unplanned sequence of action that occur in response to a particular stimulus. Some reflexes are inborn that include the withdrawal reflex. Withdrawal reflex, like pulling a hand from hot surface even before touching it. Some reflexes are learned or acquired. For example, we have the salivation. We have some reflexes, we get it by training and previous experience. That's what, like the reflex of salivation, when we hear about food, when we think about food, when we see foods or smell foods, we have increase in the salivary secretion. These reflexes are known as the conditioned reflexes, and we get it by the repeated exposure, and we get it by the process of learning. Spinal reflex means the reflex center is located in the spinal cord, like an example, the knee-jerk reflex. Cranial reflex, the center of the reflex is present in the brainstem. What is the somatic reflex? Somatic reflex involves contraction of skeletal muscle. The reflex that produces contraction of the skeletal muscle is known as the somatic reflex. The autonomic reflex, like the micturition reflex or the defecation reflex, the reflex that's mediated by the autonomic nervous system. The reflexes mediated by the autonomic nervous system, like the baroreceptor reflex affecting the cardiac muscles. Component of any reflex. The component of any reflex include sensory receptors, sensory neuron carrying the information from the receptor to the central nervous system, interneuron present in all reflexes except the stretch reflex, which is monosynaptic reflex. So this interneuron is present in all the human reflexes except stretch reflex, which is monosynaptic. Integrating center, which include the anterior horn cells present in the spinal cord or in the brainstem, motor nuclei, the efferent or the motor neuron supplying the effector organ. That is the component of the human reflexes. That is the component of any human reflex. The clinical usefulness of reflexes. Provide useful information about the health of the nervous system. So we usually examine the subject by doing some reflexes to see the integrity of the reflex and the healthy state of the nervous system. Damage or disease along the reflex arc can cause absence or abnormal reflex. Example of the reflexes is the muscle spindle reflex. If you remember, the muscle spindle is the proprioceptors consisting of interfusal muscle fibers, and this muscle spindle is stimulated by stretch. They discharge impulses, and these impulses go to the central nervous system, to the anterior horn cell to stimulate it to produce what? To produce the muscle contraction. Each muscle spindle consists of several slowly adapting sensory nerve endings that wrap around 3 to 10 specialized muscle fibers. Muscle spindles are plentiful in muscles that control fine movement and much more sparse in those that control coarse or forceful movements. Adapt slightly and slowly, so the brain receives continuous information about the position of different body parts and make adjustment accordingly. And we discussed previously the mechanism of muscle tone. We have another receptor located in the muscle, which is a Golgi tendon organ. The muscle spindle is stimulating the anterior horn cells. The Golgi tendon organ is inhibiting the anterior horn cells. The muscle spindle is a monosynaptic reflex. The Golgi tendon organ is what? Is inhibitory, producing muscle relaxation. Is important in weight discrimination. As we mentioned, one of them is producing the load reflex, and when the Golgi tendon organ, when stimulated, they produce drop of the load. the stretch reflex, or we name it as the dynamic stretch reflex. The dynamic stretch reflex is initiated by sudden tapping on the tendon, of the quadriceps muscle, which is the patellar tendon. When we produce tapping of the tendon, we stretch the whole quadriceps muscle, and consequently the muscle spindle. Stretch of the muscle spindle and the intrafusal muscle fiber stimulates this receptor, sending impulses through the afferent neurons or the sensory neuron that go into the spinal cord to synapse directly with the anterior horn cells or the motor neurons that supply the quadriceps muscle, producing contraction of the quadriceps, and they are synapsing with interneuron that interact or synapse or supply the antagonistic muscles, and they inhibit the antagonistic muscles. And the response here is the extension of the knee. So we have contraction of the quadriceps muscle and inhibition or relaxation of the hamstring muscles. The stretch reflex controls muscle length and can be elicited by tapping on a tendon attached to the muscle. And this reflex is known as the tendon jerk. Because tapping of the tendon produces jerky contraction of the muscle or jerky movement of the joint, so it is named as the tendon jerk. The tendon reflex or the Golgi tendon organ reflex. It causes relaxation of the muscle, increase in the muscle tension, stimulation of the Golgi tendon organ, and the Golgi tendon organ is going to send afferent or sensory impulses that's going inside the spinal cord and synapse with interneurons with inhibitory impulses to the muscle with increased tension and with stimulatory impulses to the antagonistic muscles. So we have relaxation of the muscles with increased tension, and we have contraction of the antagonistic muscles. Flexor withdrawal reflex. Flexor withdrawal reflex is producing or movement of the part of the body exposed to injury or pain. The stimulus here is painful stimulus, stimulating the sensory pain receptors, sending impulses to the spinal cord, and when they send impulses to the spinal cord, they are going to produce flexion withdrawal. So what's the meaning of flexion withdrawal? There is contraction of the flexors, and this contraction of the flexors is going to produce what? Movement of the limb away from the painful stimulus. But to prevent losing balance, we need to produce crossed extensor reflex. This limb is going to show flexion, while the other limb is going to show extension. So when the afferent impulses enter the spinal cord, they are going to stimulate the flexors on the same side and stimulate the extensors on the contralateral side. So the stimulated leg is going to show flexion, and the other leg is going to show extension in order to support the body weight and maintain balance. This is known as the flexor withdrawal crossed extensor. Flexor withdrawal of the limb at which the painful stimulus is applied, and crossed extensor to the contralateral limb.